Eli is a full-time student at Meadville Lombard Theological School in Chicago, and he is a candidate for ministry with the Unitarian Universalist Association. Prior to joining the ministry, Eli worked for a marketing firm and lived in San Diego, where he met his wife, who is joining us here today, as well as his father. Welcome. And earned an MBA at the University of California, San Diego. In the last year, he has since moved back to his hometown of Spokane and lives there now with his wife, Caitlin. Welcome, Eli.
Thank you all so much for joining me and welcoming me this morning. Our opening words are written by Kimberly Ann Tomzak Carlson, entitled A Place of Belonging and Caring. It is not by chance that you arrived here today. You have been looking for something larger than yourself. Inside of you there is a yearning, a calling, a hope for more, a desire for a place of belonging and caring. Through your struggles, someone nurtured you into being, instilling a belief in a shared purpose, a common yet precious resource that belongs to all of us when we share. And so, you began seeking a beloved community, a people that does not put fences around love, a community that holds its arms open to the possibilities of love, a heart home to nourish your soul and share your gifts. Welcome home, and welcome to worship. This is a responsive reading adapted by Sarah Lammert, so when I extend my hand, you will all say, "We create a web of life." So, let's try it all together. We create a web of life. This is finally the time to let go of that crazy notion that we can live separate and aloof from one another. We create a web of life. This is the time at last when we can come home to each other, to our mutual belonging. We create a web of life. And we create a web of life out of which every single one of us can use everything our stories have given us. We create a web of life. Every part of our lives, even the cruelty, even the abuse, even the addictions, even the loneliness, even the failures. We create a web of life. A web of life is created within which you can rest in that knowing. Because out of that, you can act. Out of that, all power is yours. Out of that, you travel light. Out of that, you can step forward. We create a web of life. Let every encounter be a homecoming as we step forward now for the healing of our world. The world is not going to be saved by good people or noble people. The world is going to be healed by ordinary people like you and me, who are not afraid of pain and who are not afraid of loving each other. Well, let me just say this at the front end. There is a certain risk in preaching on the Bible in a Unitarian Universalist congregation. We all, after all, have such varied relationships with this text. Some of us are Christian UUs who believe deeply in the divinity of the Bible, perhaps admitting to its faults because it was crafted by imperfect human hands. Others of us used to be active in a different faith tradition where the Bible played an important role, but we have since changed our minds and, by extension, our relationship to the text. And still further, some of us never grew up exposed to the Bible at all and look at it as a suspicious and perhaps harmful source of dogma, poorly suited as a compass for modern life. Yes, we all approach it with such different experiences and different perspectives. Why would a preacher, indeed a self-described secular humanist like myself, even dare to dip his toe into these fraught waters? I think, for better or worse, and I mean that with genuine sincerity, perhaps it's better, perhaps it's worse, I think our society is deeply shaped by these biblical stories. Even if you've never opened a Bible, I can assure you your life too has been shaped by it. For one, it has shaped our language. Perhaps even you have unwittingly quoted the Bible. Consider the expression, "There is nothing new under the sun." If you were like me, you may have attributed this to Shakespeare's 59th sonnet, but in fact these words actually originate from Ecclesiastes. If you've ever been disappointed by a fly in the ointment or encouraged your friends to eat, drink, and be merry, you also have Ecclesiastes to thank. Or maybe you've quoted Matthew if you've ever offered the criticism of the blind leading the blind or complained that your work was unappreciated, like you were casting pearls before swine. Perhaps you've remarked about being at your wit's end or lamenting that a leopard can't change its spots, or being led like a lamb to the slaughter, escaping by the skin of your teeth, or seeing the writing on the wall. In that case, you'd be referencing Psalms, Jeremiah, Isaiah, Job, and Daniel, respectively. Yes, our language has been deeply shaped by the Bible, and by this measure, so have we. But it goes beyond mere turns of phrase. Even larger paradigmatic themes have been underscored by the Bible in our society. For example, the idea that humans are separate from and have dominion over nature is a paradigm established early on in Genesis. And just to be clear, you don't need to believe in any of these paradigms explicitly for the world around you to be profoundly shaped by them. Just consider how the idea of humanity's separation from and objectification of nature influences discussions on climate change even today. This precise realization was an eye-opener for me. You see, I came to the Bible somewhat late in life, reading it in earnest for the first time in a biblical studies class in seminary. I too was struck by how much of my language had been shaped by this text I was reading truly for the first time. The Bible is also rich in narratives, myths, and stories, many of which I already had an awareness of, like the underdog analogy of David and Goliath. But of all the narratives, the one that struck with me the most was the story of the Tower of Babel. I liked it because it answered a question, a big question, in the biblical creation story. Namely, how did we, that is, humanity, go from one big happy family to a world torn apart by discord and violence? As this creation story goes, we all belonged intimately to each other at one point. So what happened? As some of you may know, the biblical origin story of human life shows up in Genesis. Now, technically, there are two differing accounts of how human life came about, that described in Genesis 1 and that described in Genesis 2. Why start a story with two different beginnings? I concede it's a good question, but beyond the scope of today's sermon. For now, I'll focus on the story of Genesis 2. In brief, that God created the heavens and earth, created man from dust, planted a garden in Eden, dropped him in, created some animals to be his partner, but none were quite enough. So God ultimately created woman to be his partner. Now, Adam and Eve didn't last long in the garden because they ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which, by all accounts, was a massive disappointment to God. And yet, I assert the day they were banished, they were still family. And when they had children and grandchildren, they were all still family. And so I was left with this gnawing question. If, as the Bible claims, we were all truly descended from the Garden of Eden, from Adam and Eve, then how did we go from one big happy family to a world, even in biblical times, that was so divided and violent? In other words, if we all belonged to one another at one point, how and why did we stop belonging to one another? The Bible's answer lies in the Tower of Babel. For those who aren't as familiar with this biblical narrative, I will briefly summarize. It is said that at one point, quote, the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as humans migrated from the east, they came upon a plain and decided to settle there. As they came together, they said, quote, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves. This tower may therefore represent the human desire for the infinite, to storm the heavens, perhaps a prideful yearning to be godlike themselves. If understood this way, then God's reaction sounds like one of fear. God said, quote, "Look, they are one people, and they all have one language. This is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing that they propose to do will be impossible for them." Perhaps God felt like they had a mutiny on their hands. So, what to do? Well, God said, "Let us go down and confuse their language there, so that they will not understand one another's speech," which is precisely what they did, scattering humans all across the face of the earth, seemingly never to be united again. The big happy family was now disbanded. Now, my reading of this passage of God punishing humanity's pride is perhaps the most conventional, but admittedly not the only one. Rabbi Shai Held, for example, views the idea that they all had one language and the same words as tantamount to saying they all had the same ideas, a total unanimity that God finds alarming. God's real plan, he argues, is that all of humanity should have rich diversity and should populate all corners of the earth. Understood in this light, God's move is not a punishment so much as, in the rabbi's words, an enforced return to the path of blessing. Essentially, humanity's instinct may have been to stay local and think small, but God insisted that we travel far and wide and converse in a rich diversity of languages and ideas. Who knows? This interpretation, like many interpretations of biblical passages, is plausible. In my mind, however, whether God dispersed us far abroad in the spirit of punishment or in a spirit of blessed exploration, the story ends in the same place. The big happy family was now disbanded. We then began disagreeing and warring among ourselves and seemingly never stopped. In other words, we lost the sense, indeed we forgot, that we all belonged to one another. I think such biblical scholarship is fascinating. Their process of interpreting and reinterpreting this text that has, as we've established, so much influence over our lives, whether we believe in its divinity or not. But I am not so naive as to believe that everybody here shares this passion. In fact, some of you may be sitting here today in this room thinking honestly, if I really put no stock in these biblical stories, in the first place, what is the use of all of this to me on this Sunday morning? If you're thinking that, that's okay. I say fair enough, and challenge accepted. Here's how I see it. These biblical stories have influenced us, whether we have opted in or not, because they pervade our culture. And indeed, what is true of biblical stories is true of stories in general. Stories serve a function in our lives by making sense of events, by connecting these disparate events into a comprehensible narrative. So, for example, it is far too easy, especially these days, to find events of division and discord. Take, for instance, the perpetual violence in the Middle East, indeed the crisis on the Syrian border as we speak, or the division in our domestic political environment. If by instinct we all seem to cry out for a story to explain these seemingly intractable divisions. Now, the Tower of Babel is certainly one such story to explain the division. As I mentioned in the opening, you may believe this story or you may not. The more important point I mean to convey is that we all have a story. When you see such division in the world, and it is all around us, globally, nationally, locally, when you see such division, how do you explain it? In other words, what is your Tower of Babel? What is your story? Indeed, we all have stories. We are helpless to create them. Perhaps, when thinking about political division, you yourself have crafted a story that sounds a little bit like this. I am reasonable, but they are blank. They are the reason for the disagreement because they are so reliably blank. See, I'm guilty of this mode of thinking as much as anyone, and more than I'd like to admit. You see, it's been a while since I've spoken with my older brother, maybe even 8 years since I've heard his voice. When people are estranged from your life, it's easy to come up with convenient stories to explain the division. Mine sounds like, I am the reasonable younger brother. But he is unreasonable. He is the reason for the disagreement because he is so reliably distant, untrusting, inaccessible. You see, I have crafted this story. And can you hear how it's a convenient one for me? So at this time, I would like to invite each of you to also consider a problem of division that is visible to you. It may be global, it may be national, maybe within your city, within your congregation, or within your family. When you bring this division to mind, listen. Listen for your story about why things are the way they are. If you were to summarize it in a sentence or two, consider quietly to yourself what that story would say. Your story may sound like, the reason for the division is ... How does that sentence end for you? Now, if there is a big aha about what I'm inviting you to consider this morning, it is this. Does your story invite you into active healing about what is broken and divided? Or does it excuse you from responsibility, perhaps encouraging you to wash your hands from the whole mess and walk away? You see, some stories lead to isolation, to resentment, to overwhelm, to fear. And other stories lead to hope, to patience, to optimism, to love, to reconciliation, to belonging. I am left to wonder myself, what stories have I built up to explain away my responsibility in healing division? That bears repeating. What stories have I built up to explain away my responsibility in healing division? More to the point, have I held on to a story that no longer serves me or this world? So, in the end, maybe it's time we start building that tower again. Perhaps we have been cast apart from each other for too long. If we can see our stories for what they are, perhaps we can all set aside the ones that no longer serve us. Perhaps we can pick up new, empowering ones. Perhaps we can turn back the clock and start building our own metaphorical tower once again. I know it may seem like a far-fetched dream, but even the God of Genesis admits to the potential of our strength. For when, quote, they are one people, nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them.